Ms. Fox will seek recognition. So
Okay.
we're going to go. Ready. Okay.
Okay.
The committee will reconvene.
The committee will reconvene. And does anyone have an amendment?
Madam Chairman,
For what purpose does the gentlelady from North Carolina seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
We will pause while the amendment is distributed.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5803 offered by Ms. Fox of North Carolina.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentlelady is recognized to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My amendment's very simple. As the underlying bill attempts to make this presumed state the legal successor to the District of Columbia in all matters, legal anomalies may arise. Specifically, the statutory scheme surrounding public corruption in the District of Columbia will be put into doubt. Due to the district's unique status, Congress already has laws on the books to ensure that officials of the District of Columbia fall under the federal bribery statute, meaning the bribery of district officials is akin to the bribery of federal officials. Congress has also explicitly identified the District of Columbia in the statute governing theft and bribery from programs receiving federal funds. I'm absolutely opposed to statehood for the District of Columbia, but my concern here is that should this initiative of statehood be successful, what would happen to these federal bribery statutes? It's very conceivable that individuals being prosecuted will utilize legal ambiguities as a mean to escape prosecution in court. My amendment would clear up legal ambiguities by establishing legislative intent at this critical juncture that these governing statutes would still apply to D.C. officials post this presumed statehood. It does so by clearly stating the federal government will be the legal successor in matters pertaining to these federal bribery statutes. Existing investigations and prosecutions would remain in the hands of federal prosecutors where they belong, and any arguments in court to exploit the changes under this bill would be moot. Now, to those who may object to the district's unique appearance in these statutes governing federal bribery, I say to you, take this up in the Judiciary Committee. If you're successful in this initiative, addressing D.C.'s unique status in the Criminal Code and the Judiciary Committee would be your next step. However, let's not let this underlying bill enable public corruption. We should make clear that current investigations and prosecutions of public corruption go unabated. Anything less would be turning a blind eye to public corruption. And let's just be frank about the amount of attention the District of Columbia retains on this subject. The D.C. Council is currently in a tailspin with respect to its handling of one of its own council members, now former councilman Jack Evans. Investigations into the former councilman found nearly a dozen instances of his using his public role to benefit private clients. Mayor Vincent Gray had a half dozen of his associates plead guilty for a massive illegal donation scheme to his campaign. In 2007, federal law enforcement arrested and charged individuals stemming from one of the costliest public corruption scandals in the district's history when they pursued fraud at the D.C. Office of Tax and Revenue, a scheme that defrauded the D.C. government of more than $16 million. Just last year, a former official of that office was arrested and charged for participating in a 5-year-long scheme through which bribes were paid to erase tax debts. I'd like to ask for unanimous consent to add this article from the Washington Post entitled, "As D.C. Leaders Tout Reforms, Latest Ethics Scandal Evokes City's History of Corruption."
Without objection.
Madam Chairwoman, the list goes on and on. Documenting public corruption in the District of Columbia is truly a difficult and Herculean undertaking. I simply don't have the time to do it in this markup. Instead, I implore my colleagues to adopt my amendment to ensure that federal prosecutions for bribery of D.C. officials do not get lost by reason of this legislation. Let's express the legislative intent necessary to empower our federal prosecutors, and let's not turn a blind eye to public corruption when this committee takes up this bill. Madam Chairwoman, this amendment would clarify any existing investigations or prosecutions relating to public corruption should in no way be affected by the creation of the new state. Residents of the District of Columbia have long struggled under the weight of public officials who have put their interests before their constituents. In the past year alone, D.C. has had scandals involving both its council and its ethics agency. Unfortunately, scandals such as these have not been unusual in the recent history of D.C. Regardless of whether it becomes a state, the district's residents deserve to have a government that works for them and not itself. I urge all members to support this amendment. I yield back.
The gentlewoman from the District of Columbia, Representative Holmes Norton, is recognized.
Well, I must say I'm truly surprised that this member, the member from North Carolina, would be the author of this amendment, given what's been happening in her state. She seems to suggest that there's more public corruption in the District of Columbia than elsewhere in our country. But over the past decade, the Department of Justice has successfully prosecuted corruption in every state represented by every Republican member sitting here today. So why would anybody want a special federal crime for public corruption for the state of Washington, D.C.? The kinds of laws that the Justice Department already prosecutes, and I'll just name a few of them. They can already prosecute local corruption, local extortion, local racketeering, theft, bribery. I won't go on. There are so many local crimes that the Justice Department can and does prosecute. Indeed, there are some recent federal corruption convictions in North Carolina, which this member represents. As recently as May 2017, North Carolina State Senator Fletcher Hartzell was sentenced to 8 months in prison for 2 counts of filing false returns and 1 count of mail fraud. Prosecutors said that he used $210,000 of campaign committee money, and here's, I'm quoting the prosecutors, to pay for personal goods and services for his own enrichment, end quote, and they included such matters as car repairs, lawn care, club memberships, vacations, and the theater tickets. I wonder what the gentlewoman thinks about those prosecutions.
I'll be happy to respond to that.
But there's more where that came from. In 2015, North Carolina State Representative Stephen LaRoque pled guilty to using grant money slated for rural development to pay for an ice skating rink for his wife and stepdaughter, and to purchase a house for another stepdaughter to rent. Now, the gentlewoman has that in her own backyard, far more serious than any recent prosecutions by public officials in the District of Columbia. So if
Well, the gentlelady
anyone,
here,
I'm not finished, if anyone would have been selected to offer this amendment, you would have thought it would have been some member whose record was clean. I do want to indicate the states where members of this committee have had successful prosecutions against local officials by the Justice Department over the past decade. Those states are, and they are represented by members at the other end of the bench: Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Ohio, the ranking member state, North Carolina, the state of the chair of the lady who of the woman who's now speaking, South Carolina, North Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, West Virginia, Wisconsin. If that is your view, start with your own states, and maybe you can impose such a condition on the new state, Washington Douglas Commonwealth. I yield back.
does anyone seek recognition?
Madam Chair, over here.
Mr. Cummock, Kentucky?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'd like to say I strongly support the lady from North Carolina's amendment, and at this time, I would like to yield the balance of my time to Representative Fox.
I thank the gentleman from Kentucky. You know, I don't tolerate or approve of any kind of corruption on the part of any official, or for that matter, I'm a pretty big proponent of the 10 Commandments. So, and I've said over and over that probably we haven't needed much beyond that, but human beings have not obeyed the 10 Commandments, therefore we have to continue to write laws. So I don't think that we should be dodging the legal anomalies and ambiguities that could arise from this underlying bill. We can address those with this very simple amendment to make sure that people in the District of Columbia can't use a loophole. If D.C. is transformed into a state, and I hope that does not happen, it is conceivable that lawyers may use this new ambiguity to evade convictions, or even that the new state may use jurisdictional claims to hinder investigations. We don't want that to be able to happen. We need to express legislative intent to ensure that this is not the case. This amendment is not discriminatory. Congress has already uniquely positioned the District of Columbia into governing statutes surrounding bribery of federal officials and bribery concerning federal property. These statutes will remain on the books. For prosecutions to continue unabated, we need to ensure we express legislative intent to do so. I don't see how the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia could say that just because there's corruption in other states, then we shouldn't be doing everything that we can to stop corruption in the District of Columbia and ensure that corruption could be prosecuted, and that we inadvertently allow for loopholes to allow people to get by with that. Again, the District of Columbia has a long history of corruption, a long, long history of corruption, and it behooves us in this body to do everything that we can to make sure that you don't have negative role models established so that people say, oh, well, just move to the District of Columbia and you can be corrupt and get by with it. We don't want the residents of the District of Columbia to struggle under the weight of public officials who put their own interests ahead of their constituents. That would be unfair, and that would be discriminatory. So we need this amendment. It's a simple amendment to make sure that the intent of Congress is understood and that we don't create loopholes. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Madam Chair.
The chair recognizes herself for 5 minutes. I'm very much opposed to this amendment. This amendment is designed to suggest that there is more public corruption in D.C. than in other states, and that is not the case. Over the past decade, the Department of Justice has successfully prosecuted public corruption in every state represented by Republican members of this committee. So there's no reason to create a special federal crime for public corruption in the state of Washington, D.C. And in fact, I ask unanimous consent to place in the record a detailed explanation of the convictions that they've had in every single state. I'll just read the first one, Arizona. In 2014, Harvard University Center for Ethics found that Arizona is the most corrupt state in America. Arizona earned a D from the Center for Public Integrity in a study that examined state government accountability and transparency. In the last decade, the Department of Justice has obtained approximately 220 public corruption convictions in Arizona. Yet no one is questioning Arizona's fitness to be a state. I urge a no vote on this amendment, and I yield back.
Madam Chair.
The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I move to strike the last word, and I'm really bewildered. First of all, I'm speaking in opposition to the amendment, but I'm kind of alarmed at the overreach of the other side. Now, this amendment that's being proposed, I find it to be redundant. Redundant because all 50 states get a U.S. attorney. And I'm sure everyone on that side knows the role and function of a U.S. attorney. In my state of Missouri, we get 2. And so at the 51st state, would it get at least 1 who would then be there to enforce federal statutes? And so why we have this redundancy and this overreach and this paternalistic approach to this proposal to allow D.C. to come in to the Union as a state is beyond me. I don't know, maybe my colleague from North Carolina can enlighten me on this. Perhaps she can justify it, but I haven't heard the justification yet of why we are going to impose double jeopardy on a new state that says, okay, we are going to, what does this amendment say? We are going to highlight the crimes of bribery of public officials, and it has to be something other than you wanting to watch out for the citizens and the taxpayers of this certain community. But you haven't made it clear. Why would you have to enhance these crimes when you and I know every state gets a U.S. attorney? Could anyone over there explain it to me? I mean, I would be glad to yield to my colleague from North Carolina. Perhaps she can shed light on it for me and explain it. And I don't see her moving to the microphone.
Well,
But
for my
I'll yield. To the
for my colleague from Missouri, as I've said, the way D.C. is handled right now and what could happen if D.C. becomes a state, which I don't believe under the Constitution it should become a state. I think the part of D.C. that is now D.C. should join the state of Maryland and be part of the state of Maryland, because that's where the property came from, as I understand it. But I believe that trial attorneys would use any possible loophole that they see, and that's why I think this needs to be done. It needs to make sure that people cannot get out of being prosecuted for a crime because of the way
and
we're doing
reclaiming my
this.
time following that logic, wouldn't a regularly appointed U.S. attorney, appointed by the President of the United States, wouldn't they also serve the purpose of enforcing federal law in this new state?
They have the authority to enforce federal law, but not on these particular statutes. There would be a problem with it.
That's not accurate, and they enforce the same statutes now. Right now, the President of the United States appoints a U.S. attorney in the District of Columbia. In this new state, we aren't taking the ability away from the President to appoint a U.S. attorney, and so why are we going through this dilatory procedure? I'm really troubled by the tenure of what I've seen today around the issue of statehood for 700,000 Americans, and it's bewildering. And at this point, I see there's no response, so I'll yield back.
Does anyone else seek a recognition? Hearing no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from North Carolina. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not adopted.
Madam Chair, I ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. A recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to Clause 2 of the Rule 11 and Committee Rule 6D, proceedings on the amendment are postponed. That's it. Is there further amendments for discussion?
Madam Chair.
Yes. Mr. Norman?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
Okay, we will pause while the amendment is distributed. Put his card up here.
No, your voice carries. You got a distinct voice. I told you that. Have people told you that before? Criminal, no. Billy Graham has a distinct voice. I've never heard one like yours. Maybe I should be a preacher. You are. You just don't know it. Carol, did you hear him?
Has everyone gotten a copy of the amendment? Nope.
Thank you.
Yeah, we did this one.
People don't, I wouldn't want to be again you. The guy I told you about,
Okay, the clerk will report the amendment.
SWAT team member I told you about, he and I get buddy.
Amendment to H.R. 5803 offered by Mr. Norman of South Carolina.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. This is really a non-controversial amendment that I think it will be supported by 100% of the members here, because really what it is an amendment of fairness. And it involves the federal payments for the Public Defender Service. Basically, what this bill does is if the District of Columbia is granted statehood, which I'm going to strongly oppose, but if it does, it makes it, as my good friend Mr. Heiss said, less bad. It'll terminate federal payments for the state's Public Defender Service after 180 days and requires the state to pay back the associated cost. Congress created the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia in 1970. Since 1997, when Congress was forced to step in and rescue the district from financial ruin, the Public Defender Service has submitted its budget request to Congress. In fiscal year 2019, Congress provided D.C. with $45.9 million of federal money for the Public Defender Service. Funding the D.C. criminal justice system is costly, and the Public Defender Service is just one part. It's estimated that in fiscal year 2020, Congress will spend between $716 million and $741 million on the D.C. court system. This amendment will end the federal government's role in funding and supporting the new state's Public Defender Service, 180 days after the state is admitted to the Union. The amendment will place the financial and managerial burden of the Public Defender Service on the state that they serve. It'd be unfair of the federal government to fund the judicial branch of the new state while all other states are responsible for funding their own judicial systems. Again, this is very non-controversial, and I hope all of my fellow congressmen will support this amendment. I yield back.
The gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Eleanor Holmes Norton, is recognized.
Well, Madam Chair, the other side must want to stay here all night. We're ready, if you're ready, because they appear to be going down every single function of the District of Columbia. When I think about this amendment, I say, wait a minute, we've been here, done that, but now they're doing transition period assistance based on, of all agencies, the Public Defender Service. So you can imagine how many agencies we could keep going here. But what we should bear in mind is that every state that has entered the Union has received some kind of transition assistance to support public services, to make sure economic development continues. I want to quote the Government Accountability, the GAO office. Each state's diverse characteristics contributed to the varying amount and type of assistance provided. We don't know what assistance will be provided to the District of Columbia. What we know for sure is that some assistance should be provided. We do know that in the past, for example, assistance for services of various kinds, land grants, even partial exemption from federal taxes, the district doesn't ask for anything that every other state that has come into the Union, anything different from every other state that has come into the Union. All the district asks for is equal treatment, so the other side can come agency after agency. It's going to be our state, so we will enjoy countering the notion agency by agency that there should not be a transition period and that there should not be transition funds the way your states indeed had when they came into the Union and got statehood.
Ms. Norton, will you yield?
Who asked me to yield? Yes, I will yield to the gentleman.
Thank you so much. No, what I would add is every other state, every state in the Union gets different services at different amounts. What this is doing is giving an exemption for a new state that from what I've heard here today, you want to have you're claiming 700,000 people need a vote. Well, if they're going to form a state and make up that state, they ought to bear their share of the expenses. They're going to apply just like every other state for different.
Reclaiming my time, we will indeed bear the brunt of the expense. All that the new state will be asking for is the same kind of transition funding that your state got and that every state that requested it got. It is not a special pleading notion. It is an equality notion. Only give us what your state got, no more, no less. And by the way, we don't know how much yet. That is yet to be decided. And the Congress of the United States will have a definitive say on how much aid it receives. So your time will come when the state needs transition funding for the Public Defender Service, as with this amendment, or for anything else. I yield back. I yield back to the gentleman.
No, Ms. Norton, I would just say that, if your argument is that they deserve this and that it's an amount that is that every other state ought to bear, you're talking about the federal government paying every dollar of the Public Defender Service. It's given it 180 days leeway time, but after that time expires, you pay whatever the cost is. And I would say that it's not fair to the other 50 states, if this is enacted, to put the burden on it. But again, it's just a disagreement of opinion.
Reclaiming my time. I'm only requesting transition assistance, not that they pay for every dollar that the public defender needs. Remember, what the statehood bill is about is equality. Give us equal treatment, the same treatment that your state got. Certainly no more, no less. And here we're all talking off the top of our heads because we don't know how much transition funding the state will even request or whether Congress will grant it. I yield back.
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman.
The gentleman is recognized, Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Numerous states have received the transition assistance as they become a new state. Alaska, for example, was given 103 million acres, a separate 400,000 acres for community development, and a share of the profits and proceeds from federal activities. So there's nothing unusual about this. People who live in the nation's capital pay federal taxes. In fact, we have data in front of us right now showing that they pay higher per capita as a community than any state does, and more in hard dollars than 22 states do. So the idea of making them pay back for a service that they've already paid into through their federal taxes makes no sense to me. It does underscore what's really taking place in terms of the development of a new state, which is that for the first time, the people who live in Washington, D.C., which would now be called Washington Douglas County, would be able to name their own judges, would be able to elect their own prosecutors. That is a right that Americans have cherished and held dear since the beginning of the Republic. In fact, if you look in the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Particulars against the king, one of the things the king did was to impose judges and justice systems on the people without their consent. So the people in the new state would have the authority to develop their own judicial system with their own prosecutors and their own public defenders, as well as have the federal U.S. attorneys, as Mr. Clay points out, and whatever federal public defender service would go along with it. There's nothing unusual about any of this. If you want to know what the model is for the new state, just look at every other state. That's the model for it. And there are historical differences in how all of the states come into being, but they're not asking for anything that any other state hasn't received, and they're not asking for anything that they don't deserve. And I think it should be a cause for celebration across the country that we can admit this community into the union of states on a level of political equality. I yield back to the chair.
Does anyone else seek recognition? Hearing no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered from the gentleman. And all those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Madam, request recorded vote.
Okay, a recorded vote has been requested. A recorded vote is so ordered. And pursuant to Clause 2 of Rule 11 and Committee Rule 6D, proceedings on the amendment are postponed. And we thank you, Mr. Norman. Okay. Okay, Mr. Comer from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
Okay, the amendment will be distributed, and we will pause while the amendment is being distributed.
Thank you.
Has everyone received the amendment? No. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5803 offered by Mr. Comer of Kentucky.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And like the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss, and the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman, I oppose D.C. statehood. However, I feel like if we can do anything to make the bill better, then it's our responsibility as members of Congress to govern and to do that. Therefore, I have this amendment. And this amendment revolves around the fact that Washington, D.C. currently gets a special payment for their court system that no other state gets. If Washington were to become a state, then this amendment would terminate that special federal payment because that would be unfair to the other 50 states. Due to fiscal and managerial problems in the early 90s, as have been mentioned already, Congress created the District of Columbia Financial Responsibility and Management Assistance Authority, also known as the Control Board, in '95 to oversee D.C.'s finances. The Control Board recommended removing several costly state functions, such as the court system, from the district's finances. As a result, in 1997, the federal government began to fund the district's courts under the National Capital Revitalization and Self-Government Improvement Act. Funding the D.C. court system is very costly. It's estimated that in fiscal year 2020, D.C. courts will receive between $716 million and $741 million from the federal government. This amendment will end the federal government's role in funding and supporting the new state's court system 180 days after the state is admitted to the Union. The amendment will place the financial and managerial burden of the courts on the state in which they sit, just like the other 50 states. Because it would be unfair of the federal government to fund the judicial branch of the new state while all other states are responsible for funding their own judicial system. I urge the members to support this amendment, and I yield back.
The gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Eleanor Holmes Norton, is recognized.
Madam Chair, this is beginning to be redundant. The gentleman said he wanted to make the bill better. What he wants to do is to make the new state fail. But the transition costs, which will pay for transition of all function, will help pay for transition of the courts to full control by the District of Columbia. It is true that the district, which was the only jurisdiction in the United States to pay for all state and local federal, state, and local funding, had to give that up in 1997. It just became too much for a state, for a district. But look at the district's recovery now. The district has gained population. The district has one of the highest per capita, district residents have, I believe, the highest per capita income in the United States. So the notion of taking back the courts is something that the district looks forward to. These are called Article 10 courts. So they are federal courts in the sense that our Superior Court, our Court of Appeals, are technically federal courts, but they hear only local matters. Therefore, they ought to be local courts, and we agree that the state should pay for them. But this amendment goes to transition funding. We do not know how that transition funding will be used, but to pick function by function in order to try to make the district pay instantly for every function would put the district at odds with how this body has treated every other state that came into the Union. Don't worry about the district picking up all of state functions and paying for them. That we agree to by filing this bill. All we ask for is the same kind of transition funding that has been available to the states from which every member has come. I yield back.
Madam Chair,
I yield to the gentleman. I recognize the gentleman.
I just simply want to reiterate the point that there's a 6-month transition period in this language that will transition from D.C. becoming a city to a state if this bill were to pass. So there is a 6-month transition period, 180 days. I yield back.
Okay. Does anyone else seek recognition? Hearing no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not adopted.
Madam Chair, call for a roll call vote.
Okay, a recorded vote has been requested. A recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to Clause 2 of Rule 11 and Committee Rule 6D, proceedings on the amendment are postponed. Thank you. Okay, Mr. Keller. Mr. Keller?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Okay, we shall pause while the amendment is distributed.
Which one do you have first? Thank you.
Thank you. Which amendment do you want to do first, Mr. Keller?
Number 11,
Number 11?
They're not numbered.
They're not numbered.
the sanctuary city, no sanctuary city policy.
No sanctuary city, okay. All right. Has everyone received the bill, the amendment? The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5803 offered by Mr. Keller of Pennsylvania.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My amendment prevents any existing D.C. sanctuary city laws from being transferred to the laws of the new capital. Under H.R. 5803, D.C. laws will be applied to the new capital. However, currently, the District of Columbia is a sanctuary city, which means it is a jurisdiction which refuses to cooperate with or enforce federal immigration laws. In October 2019, D.C. Council member Charles Allen, a Democrat from Ward 6, introduced and City Council passed an emergency bill with the specific intent of avoiding congressional oversight and enhancing government-sanctioned protections for illegal aliens by banning city agencies from providing information about illegal aliens to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. The non-emergency bill would also prohibit the D.C. Department of Corrections, which is paid for by federal taxpayers, from allowing federal immigration authorities to enter D.C. facilities. Councilman Allen believes he is doing the right thing by allowing illegal aliens to remain in D.C., even if they've committed a crime. However, the right thing is to follow the laws of this land and work cooperatively with federal law enforcement, including immigration authorities. Americans heard last week from President Trump about the dangers of sanctuary city policies. It is not in the best interest of Americans anywhere to live in a sanctuary city where known dangerous criminals are allowed to prowl the streets, so liberal governments can carve their base's desires. In just one example from Pennsylvania, Juan Ramon Vasquez was released from custody by Philadelphia law enforcement authorities who did not inform ICE of his illegal status due to the city's sanctuary policies. Vasquez then went to rape his girlfriend's 5-year-old daughter. If the ICE detainer would have been honored, this horrific crime would have never occurred. This amendment would prevent D.C.'s misguided and dangerous sanctuary city laws from applying to the new capital region. Instead, the new capital region would fully comply with the federal law enforcement. For the safety of people, if D.C. should become a state, I urge support of this amendment. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlelady from the District of Columbia. Eleanor Holmes Norton is recognized.
Madam Chair, I don't know how many times I need to cite the equal footing doctrine, which keeps Congress from imposing conditions on new states that cannot be imposed on existing states. So here comes another condition. But this one meets a more formidable opponent, the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court and the federal courts have held that the federal government cannot commandeer a state or local government to enforce local law. So throughout the United States, you have sanctuary cities. There is nothing pending against these sanctuary cities because this is a federal matter. The federal government wants to make sure its laws are followed with respect to immigration or anything else. It can't go through the states to do that. It doesn't go through existing states, and this amendment seeks to have the federal government use its sanctuary city policy, which cannot be used at the moment against any state, to use that sanctuary city policy against the new state. The equal footing doctrine keeps you from doing that. Existing law keeps you from doing that. We should vote against this amendment.
Does anyone else seek recognition?
Madam Chair.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. I strongly support the gentleman's amendment, and at this time, I'd like to yield the balance of my time to Congressman Keller.
I thank the gentleman. The point I want to make is this doesn't apply to the new state. It applies to the remaining part that would remain being the District of Columbia, the federal government. And by making sure that those laws were enforced in the area that would then remain as the federal government's area, it would keep citizens in surrounding communities, your new state, more safe. Thank you, and I yield back.
Does anyone else seek recognition? I tell you, the amendment is a distraction from the real issues here, granting equal rights to hundreds of thousands of disenfranchised citizens and Americans, and the Supreme Court and federal courts throughout the country have held that the federal government cannot commandeer state and local governments to enforce federal law. It is the height of hypocrisy for people who say they support states' rights to impose conditions on the state of Washington, D.C. I yield back, and hearing no further discussion,
Madam Chair,
I yield to.
he wants this matter to apply to the federal district. So when he gets jurisdiction over the federal district, he can do whatever he can get the Congress to pass with respect to the federal district. This committee cannot make any law during this proceeding affecting the federal district, which does not exist and will not exist until the statehood bill passes. So I ask the member to reserve that matter until after this bill passes the House and the Senate.
That's a good point. Does anyone else seek recognition? Hearing no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania. All those opposed say no. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not adopted.
Could we get a recorded vote, please?
A recorded vote has been requested. A recorded vote is so ordered. And pursuant to Clause 2 of Rule 11 and Committee Rule 6D, proceedings on the amendment are postponed. Okay. Mr. Keller.
I have an amendment at the desk.
Well, we will suspend while the amendment is distributed. You think this is the last one?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Clerk will report.
Amendment to H.R. 5803, offered by Mr. Keller of Pennsylvania.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with.
Ones that were imposed
The
on
gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
government expense.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As was explained earlier, due to the financial and managerial issues in the 1990s, Congress created the District of Columbia Financial Responsibility and Management Assistance Authority, known as the Control Board, in 1995 to oversee D.C.'s finances. The Control Board recommended removing several costly state functions, such as pension system, from the district's finances. The responsibility for funding the pensions of D.C. police officers, firefighters, judges, and teachers were shifted to the federal government. At the time the law was enacted, D.C. had an unfunded pension liability of $4.7 billion. Since then, the pension liability has increased at a rate of several $100 million per year. To this day, the federal government continues to administer and make payments to the D.C. Pension Fund. This amendment would eliminate the special federal involvement in the new state's pension liabilities. Having served on Pennsylvania's School Employees Retirement System Board, one of the nation's largest pension systems, I know the importance and difficulties in states needing to manage their own pension liabilities. However, this is an important state function. If D.C. wants statehood, they need to take the benefits as well as the responsibilities. The new state and its local municipalities should bear the burden of funding its own pension programs, just like every other state and municipality in this country. And I know we're probably going to hear the same things about having to go through every department. I would have thought that the members pushing for statehood would have already done that and understood these costs. And these are not costs that should be spread across the other 50 states. As it's been said earlier in this hearing, the cost in every state that came to the union, every member is in a state that got these benefits. Well, I'm from Pennsylvania, and the first, if history serves me right, the first government, or the first capital city of the United States was New York City from 1785 to 1790, and Philadelphia from 1790 to 1800. So let's not play the games of distraction. If people want D.C. to be a state, let's not try and not take responsibility for the functions that belong to the state. We can have all these discussions, but again, there are responsibilities that come along with being a state. And if D.C. has the highest per capita income in the United States, they should not have any problem taking these financial responsibilities as a state and funding them themselves, rather than trying to do something different than every other state and push those on to the states in the union. So I would urge members to support this amendment. Thank you, and I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Eleanor Holmes Norton.
I want to assure the gentleman that the new state is ready to take on any pension liabilities for which it is responsible. The only reason Congress relieved the district of the unfunded pension liabilities you speak of is because it was Congress who made those liabilities. The district did not have home rule at the time. So Congress relieved the district of the liabilities because the federal government had created those unfunded liabilities when the federal government itself ran the District of Columbia. Yes, remember this, not until 1973 did the district even have a home rule government. So in assuming the liabilities, and we assure you that we have assumed any liabilities that have come under our jurisdiction since, but in assuming these liabilities, the Congress acknowledged that D.C. had met its financial obligations. And here I want to quote what Congress have said, that did not occur any liabilities that did not occur because of any action taken or any failure to act that lay within the power of the District of Columbia government. What the gentleman is talking about are federal responsibilities, which the federal government itself admitted, conceded, should be its to take over. We will take care of any pension liabilities accrued by the new state. I yield back.
Does anyone else seek recognition? Hearing no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered for the gentleman from the great state of Pennsylvania. And all those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. 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 In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not adopted. Yes. A recorded vote has been requested. A recorded vote is so ordered and pursuant to Clause 2 of Rule 11 and Committee Rule 6D, proceedings on the amendment are postponed. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record 3 letters submitted in support of DC Admissions Act, one from the American Civil Liberties Union, one from the National Active and Retired Federal Employees, and one from the End Citizens United Action Fund. Without objection, so ordered. There being no further discussion on amendments, the previous question is ordered. It is now in order to take previously votes on amendments. In order to give members sufficient notice, we will recess, subject to the call of the chair. I expect we will resume and vote at 4:45.
The committee's in
Recess.
recess.
It's not very critical.